Hello YouTube, it's been a while, it's been nearly 3 years, so I've quite possibly forgotten how to do this. So I'm going to throw a little informal video out there. This isn't attached to a series, we're not making a game, it's just some playing around to see if I can still make videos and if it's worth continuing. We're going to be looking at TweenLite. It's a tool I've made quite a bit of use of but never really covered in a video. There's loads of awesome tutorials for it on their website, so I'm not going to really dwell on the basic stuff. I'll very quickly do a basic tween just for the sake of it, but then we're going to quickly build it up to something a bit more showy. So I've got this little doodle in Flash, and using TweenLite library, I've made it animating in the order it was drawn. So it saves a lot of time animating. To animate that piece by piece would have been a pretty hefty job, but instead it's replaced by, I don't know, about 12 lines of code that bring it all in the order, and it's very customizable. They could come in different ways. You could change the timing really easily, and there's the result. And using Flash's export movie option, you can actually export a HD video of all of that. So if you are some form of artist and you want to show your process a little bit, it's a great way to make big, high definition videos that actually show it all coming together. We're going to do this in 3 Flash Pro, but we're going to use ActionScript 3, and I'm going to attempt to run a HTML5 version alongside it as well. So that's fairly new to me, but it's the way the world's going, so we've got to get with the times. And yeah, so we're going to run them side by side. We'll start with the setup. So I've got a file for each. I've just basically gone File, New, and we've got an ActionScript 3 file in this case, saved it, and then for the HTML5 version, same process, File, New, but you've got this HTML5 canvas option at the top. So make one of each, or make the one you want to work in, get that saved. I've got them in the same folder here, and we can see actually the HTML5 version of the earlier one. It's slightly different. The colour options when you export from Flash aren't quite as nice in HTML5. You can't do tints as well. The blend modes are a bit more restricted, so I can't multiply the big red finish that we had in the other one, but it still looks quite nice. I had to tinker with it a little bit. The tweening is slightly different as well. You notice these windows actually come in bit by bit, whereas they didn't in the Flash version. So when it finally reverses, that's actually quite a nice little addition. A happy accident, if you will. So let's close that one. Before we start, we're going to have to download the Flash version. We're going to get that one set up first. So on the Greensock website, I'm going to go to Products and find the Flash version of GSAP. Now, I've already downloaded it, but if you just hit the download button, you want to get this zip file and take the COM folder out of it. So I've just got the COM file and I've put it next to my FLA so that we can find it from the code. And just to check that's working, in Flash here, in the Flash version, I'm just going to quickly make a symbol to use. So I'm going to make a little block. Let's make sure it's a symbol as well. So I've drawn the shape, need to convert it to a symbol, and let's call it block. So the class is called block, but it also needs an instance name if we're actually going to manipulate it with code. So in the properties panel, with my block selected, I'm just going to call this B. So its name is B, and I can reference it from code now. So that's pretty much the visual setup for now. We are going to elaborate on that a little bit, but let's make a new layer. Let's call it code and open up the actions panel so we can actually type some code in. In the Actions panel, I'm going to start by importing this Greensock flashlight library, TweenLite, sorry. Import, and then we want the COM folder we've just pasted in, .greensock, and I'm just going to be lazy and import everything with a star. So you could be a bit more specific. We're only really using TweenLite for the next couple of minutes. And underneath that, I'm going to make a tween, and it's dead straightforward, one line to make a tween. So I'm going to put TweenLite. And you can prompt yourself with control space if you want to pop up the hints. TweenLite dot, and then we've got a load of options. You can do various different things. I just want to tween my block to a position. So I'm going to type 2 and then a bracket. And here's where you're prompted to give the object name that you want to work with. In this case, it's B. That's what we just called it. Comma, and then the duration in seconds. So let's say 1.5 seconds. Another comma, and we need an object. An object's written shorthand using curly brackets like this, so everything in between these brackets is the information inside the object, and these are the bits you want to tween. So in this example, let's tween the X value, so the horizontal position of the block, put an X and a colon, and then the number of where you want the tween to finish in this case. So we're going to the place that we put. So I'm going to tween it to 400 in the X-axis. And then I'm going to close the function call and just end the line with a semicolon. And let's give that a try. If we Control Enter or Command Enter if you're on a Mac, I've left the outline. But it did work. Let's just flip back to my stage. I'm going to move that. I'm going to delete the outline and let's try that again. There we go. We've got a tween. So that's the absolute basics. Like I said, the website does cover that, but at least we're set up now. Let's flick to the HTML5 version because it's slightly more involved. So I'm going to flick to my HTML5. In fact, I'm going to copy my block first from my Flash version. So I'm going to copy my block. If you're just doing the HTML5 version, make sure you've created a block, make sure it's a symbol, make sure it's got an instance name. Position it there, and let's flick back to Greensock because we need to actually get the HTML5 version. So I'm going to flick to product at the top, find the HTML5 version of GSAP, and click the download button. This time you can download it all if you want to, but the thing with websites is they tend to be online, so you might just want to use the online resource. So I'm going to copy this line instead. This is their suggested route as well if you watch their tutorials for getting set up. So I'm going to copy this line, and I did copy it. I'm going to flick back to Flash, but we don't put it in here, so we are going to come across a bit of an issue in a second. I'm going to start by just doing the code. So very similar, I'm going to add a layer for the code. I'm going to flick to the actions for that. And then the code is very similar, there's a slight change. So I'm going to do TweenLite.to, and this time we can't just put B. For whatever reason, the create.js that Flash uses to make its HTML5 needs us to reference everything with this dot B for the object this time. We'll go with the same duration and the same object again, just to keep it consistent. So the code's very similar, just with the addition of this. However, if I test that now, it's not going to work, so let's give it a go. Save it up, Control Enter. Notice it pops up in a browser, but it doesn't work. It doesn't even draw out the cube, the block, because there's a problem. And the slight difficulty in Flash is that the debugging for JavaScript isn't the best. But the issue we've got is that it has no idea what TweenLite is, and that's because we've not made use of that link that we just copied. And the place it goes is generated when you first make that HTML5 export. So we've got this HTML file in our folder now. We need to edit that. So if you right click and go edit it with your editor of choice, you can just use Notepad or text edit, but I've got Sublime Text installed, so I'm going to use that. I just need to paste that line in where all the other script imports are. So just there, I'm going to throw it in and I'm going to save that. Now if I flick back to that folder and run the HTML5 file, notice it does work. So that's working straight away when I save it and boot it back up. However, if I jump back to Flash and export it again, it breaks. And that's because Flash is overwriting the HTML5 file every time. Oh, sorry, the HTML file every time. Notice it's taken that paste out. So you've got to be careful to either not export in that way, or to just paste it back in every time, which might get annoying. So I'm going to save it this one time. I'm going to go back to Flash, and I'm going to go File, Publish Settings, and I'm going to tell Flash not to bother publishing the HTML. Now apparently more recent versions of Flash CC, mine seems resistant to update. There's nothing listed as an update, but in more recent versions you can just tell it not to overwrite the HTML and you should be okay. I'm just going to ask it not to publish it at all. And I'm going to hit publish. It's going to update my files, and I'm just going to have to run it from here or refresh a version that's already open in my browser. But notice that did work. So refresh it and the tween works. So that's the setup. Just got to be wary now that in my HTML5 version I don't do the quick export. I've got to actually publish it and refresh in the browser. Going to expand on it a little bit now. So I'm actually going to make a scene that's worth animating, but I'll start really basic, just maybe a few blocks, just to cover a couple of issues. So what we've got here is one block. I'm going to make, I don't know, let's make a castle. So we'll start with the basics of a castle. I'm just going to move it, scale it up, Just duplicate it, so another one there, and I'm going to have a smaller version of it in the middle that I'll eventually maybe put an arch through. That'll do for now. So we've got 3. At the moment they're all called B, so I'm just going to rename them to B1, B2, and B3. It's not the greatest castle, but we will build on it a bit later. And the code for it now, you might imagine, would be pretty straightforward. You could just copy this. In fact, that needs editing because we don't have B anymore. So I could just put B1, B2, and B3. And maybe let's change these. So instead of coming in from the X, they're coming in the Y. But that's actually going to move them to a position. I want to animate them from a location. So I'm actually going to change to from. So it's another little function of TweenLite. You can choose which direction. So do you want to tween to where it starts, or to this destination, or from it to where it originally was? So quite a nice little way of doing things. That didn't work, did it? It's because I put B2 twice. Let's put B3. Give it another go, and there we go. So they all tween in, but they all tween in at the same time, and I'm sure you can see a bit of a problem where I've had to copy and paste that twice. If I was to do that for everything and I was building a bit more of a complicated scene, there's a lot of work there. I might as well just do the old-fashioned create motion tween and hand animate it. So we are going to automate this process a little bit. But just before that, I want to kind of point at one more thing that we are going to make use of, and that's the TweenLite or TweenLine. No, it's not TweenLine, it's a timeline. The timeline from Greensock that we're going to use to have multiple tweens stitched together in a row. So I'm actually going to get rid of all of this. Just bear in mind how it works, because they're useful on their own. But I'm actually going to make a variable. I'm going to call it timeline, not to be confused with the main timeline down here, but the Greensock tool is called a timeline. I'm going to hit colon, and I'm going to start typing timeline, and it should prompt me for it. So I'm going to make a TimelineLite. Make it a new TimelineLite. That'll do. And I'm going to quickly add all 3 of those objects to this timeline and make it do them in a row. So I'm going to put timeline dot, and then we're going to use from, because that's the last tween we did. And the target object here needs to be an array this time. So an array in shorthand is done with a square bracket. We just put B1, B2, and B3. Comma, the duration is going to stay as 1.5, and the objects are, let's see, going to stay the same. So it's Y from, let's increase it a little bit so they come from off the bottom, from 600. And then this position should let us change when the tweens start, but let's just put, I don't know, 0.5 for now. And there'll be a slight issue with that, which we'll fix. Notice they all come in, but they all still come in together. Now this last bit, this position number, potentially could have been their start position from the end of the last tween, but that's not quite how it works. So what we're going to do instead is do a stagger from, which would let us offset the start of those. So instead of from, I'm going to stagger from, and I'm going to put that number back. So I have 0.5 there. And this time, they're staggered, so they come in at half-second intervals. That pretty much translates directly to the HTML5 version. So at this point, I'm going to copy these 2 lines. I'm going to jump to HTML5 and just paste them in. I need to flick back to the Flash version and grab my content, so I'm going to copy them. It's all getting a bit messy, but you get the idea. And just update the code slightly so that it works as HTML5. We don't want this typing. We can't tell a JavaScript object what type of information it is for whatever reason. I think we could use TypeScript to maybe get around that. And then we need this in front of all of our objects. So this, this, this. And because I'm in HTML5, I'm not going to quickly export it. I'm going to publish it, hop to my browser, and refresh the page. And there we go. So I'm waffling on a bit there, but we're getting somewhere. I'm going to automate the whole process in a second. But they're the 2 tools we've used, a basic tween and now this new timeline thing, which is lots of tweens stitched together, which is quite useful. So I'm going to spend a couple of minutes. This isn't an art tutorial, so I'm not going to dwell on this too long, but I'm going to make a bit more of an interesting castle. So we've got our basic building blocks. I'm going to delete them all, bring one in from the library that I can just duplicate, and I'm going to make a few to go with it. So I want a kind of a top to this castle, so I'm going to draw a bit of a rectangle and just deform it a bit with the transform tools or the basic selection tools. Get rid of the outline, don't need that. Maybe bend this a little bit. So that'll do as a roof. I'm going to convert that to a symbol. Let's call it roof. Okay, and let's maybe have an arch. So we do need an arch in the middle for our, whatever it is, portcullis. So I'm going to start that with a rectangle. And then just to cut out of it, I'm going to make a circle. And then just snap from the edges of that circle with the line tool. So just press N on the keyboard there and then stitch that up. Fill the gap with the bucket tool and delete the outline. So I've got an arch. With that arch selected, just so I can clip it out of this rectangle, I'm going to change its colour. Make it really obvious, make it red. And just position it where you think you'd need to cut it out. Deselect it, select it again, delete it. We've got an arch. Let's convert that to a symbol. Make sure we don't have an outline on that. Let's call that arch. And finally, let's have a little flag. Let's just take, I don't know, take the pen tool. Click again and drag to get a bit of a wave to it. And over here, and maybe the last one there. Just going to select that, copy it, I'm going to paste it where it is, and then flip it upside down with the flip vertical. Oops, I didn't actually paste it, I thought I made a new version. Sorry, duplicate it, and modify, transform, flip vertical, drag it down a little bit, let's select it again, snap it to itself. I've missed a bit, let's get rid of you. And I just want to scale that whole thing down, it's not really coming to a point there either, so let's do that. Scale it down a bit, you can spend a lot more time on yours. And I'm just going to stitch the ends together with another line. That looks horrible. Let's fill it and delete the outline. Don't want the fill to be red, so I'm going to make that black. And there we go, we've got a flag. It took a bit longer than it should have done. Convert to symbol, flag. Okay, so we can build a scene now. I'm going to start with the basics of the castle. Let's drag this in. So this can be one side. Let's just scale it up a little bit. Bring in an arch to match. I'm just holding my Alt key to duplicate stuff here, by the way. I should have duplicated that original block. I'm happy enough with that size. I'm going to duplicate this block, go on the other side, maybe scale it out that way a bit. We need another one at the top because it doesn't look quite right. So let's scale that down a bit. I'm going to zoom in a touch. Get rid of my actions bar because it's annoying me. And let's duplicate it, scale it down, make a few little rocks at the top, whatever they're called. Just holding the Alt key to quickly duplicate. I'm going to duplicate another one of these. I'm going to have a peaky bit at the end. Scale this one right up, and that car needs to shut up. Scale it in, and let's put a roof on this one. So I'm going to copy in one of my roof objects. Needs a bit of scaling. And I'm going to quickly duplicate it and flip it. Let's get that lined up. Still not quite right, but you can spend a bit more time on it. That's not terrible. Let's make a flagpole at the top of it using a basic square. Oops. Scale that way in and right down. Move it up there and stick a flag on it. A hideous flag. Yeah, you get the idea. I'm sure you can expand on it a bit more. Let's copy that whole thing. So that's side of the castle. Oops. Let's get them and that. Alt key, drag it over here. Let's maybe have another one that's scaled down a bit. And connected with another block. Should have put some music on. Copy a few of these little things, and we've got a castle then, haven't we? Maybe just one. Could do a roof in the middle, put a few flags or something. I'm going to leave it at that. So we've got a castle. Let's put it a bit more central. The important thing is that it's made up of symbols. We can't have this made of shapes for the Flash version at least, because it won't tween in. So it's a bunch of symbols. We're going to see them come in bit by bit. But if I was to do that the way we've been going about it so far, I'd have to go through and painstakingly name everything and then list them in my code. So we're going to automate the process a little bit by looping through everything on the screen. So with the castle set up, I'm going to flick to my action script and pretty much get rid of at least the bottom bit. Yeah, so I'm going to get rid of this bottom bit. I will use the timeline, but just for starters, I'm going to use a basic TweenLite, and I'm going to apply this to everything that's in the display list. So I'm going to do a for loop. For, and then bracket, it's going to make a variable to count through everything on the screen. So I'm just going to call it I. It's going to be an integer, and it's going to start at 0. We're going to count up until or while I is less than the number of children on the screen. And at the end of every iteration, we want I to get bigger by 1. And in there, we just want to tween the current child that we're looking at. So I'm going to put a TweenLite line, TweenLite dot, and let's have from. The target will be get child at I. The duration, let's say 0.5, half a second, and the variables are going to be the y from, let's say, 500. Now there's a little trick to actually doing it relative from where the object is, so we'll come back and adjust that in a second. But that should apply a tween to everything, and if it's done right, they should all come in a kind of a uniform system. Let's give it a go. There we go. So the tween did work. It's a bit uninspired. It could have just been one tween for everything there, one big object. So this is where this timeline is going to be more useful. So instead of using a tween, just a single tween for each object, we're going to make use of this timeline we've already set up. And what that will do is, instead of using TweenLite from, use timeline from, and that will add every tween to the end of the last one. And by doing that, we build this big string of animation that will bring them in one by one. And I really should have made them a bit faster, because that's very slow. But it works. Okay. Now it's not the nicest looking animation at the moment, so we can do a bit of playing around with these properties. So I did mention you can do it relative. So instead of putting the 500 as an exact starting point, I don't want every object to start from 500 in the y-axis. I want them to start relative to where they are. So instead of putting a number, I can put quotes, and in there I'm going to put minus, equals, and a little number. So let's say 50. And what this means is that every object will start from 50 pixels above where it currently is. In addition to that, I'm going to put a comma, and I'm also going to tween the alpha of the object. So I want the alpha to tween from 0, so it starts invisible and becomes visible over the duration of the tween. So let's give that a go. There's a bit of a delay after that first one because I've still got the objects off the right of the screen that are also tweening in, but we could remove the originals later on. But that's a bit nicer. It's still kind of slow. I think waiting for everyone to finish before the next one starts is a bit of a chore. So what we can do after this object is make use of the position information for each tween. So we could put a solid number, just to make every tween start at the exact same time, which would be totally pointless. Or we can use this relative idea again. So in quotation marks, I'm going to put minus equal, and this needs to be it needs to have some kind of relationship with the amount of time each tween takes. So if every tween's half a second, and I want to overlap them a little bit, I could take a quarter of a second. So I could do minus 0.25 off the start of every tween, and that would make it start halfway through the last one. And we should get a bit of a faster animation. There we go. So the individual movement of each piece is the same, but the next tween starts earlier. So we get a kind of a faster, better version of it. And you can play around with that as much as you like. You can add rotation in maybe. So let's rotate from minus 90, so they flip in 90 degrees. Oops, need a colon. So as they come in, they also rotate, which is quite nice. You could add some X movement to that to make it seem like flipping in kind of dynamically. What else have we got? Instead of having the alpha, let's replace that with the scale. So let's do a scale X from 0 and a scale Y from 0. Give that a go. Now they rotate and scale, like they're popping into existence, which is quite nice. Bear in mind they do rotate around the pivot point, so you've got to be careful when you're making your objects if you're going to use rotation. I'm going to dumb it down a bit. I just want what I had originally, so I'm going to get rid of that and just put the alpha to 0. So that's the basics. That's every object that happens to be on your main timeline coming in back to back. There's a bit of an issue if you've got objects inside objects, which we are going to come back to and cover, but I think at this point it might be nice to do the HTML5 version because it's a bit different. I am going to maybe cut this chunk of code out, but I'll come back for it. The most important bit is to get the actual castle. So I'm going to copy the castle. I'm going to flick to my HTML5 canvas and just delete what's there. Paste that castle in place and just jump back and get my code. Might save me about 3 keystrokes. Yeah, copy that. And we'll throw it in there and we'll delete. So the code's very similar. Notice there's no typing. We don't type our timeline in HTML5. So we don't type this int either. Num children in its current guise won't work. That will have to be this dot get num children. And there is a bit of an issue with HTML5 that we might come across, or at least the HTML5 export from Flash, that might rear its head in a second. This needs to be this dot get child at. And hopefully that works. I mean, that's a bit rushed, but let's give it a go. Save it and publish it. Flick to the browser and refresh. Well, it's drawn it, but it's not tweened anything. So, yeah, bit of an issue there. What I think is, it's the issue with num children that I just mentioned. What I think Create.js does, Create.js is the library that exports the Flash content. I think it runs this code before it actually draws the scene. So what we might need to do, it's a bit of a hacky way of doing it, is in the timeline at the bottom, just move the code to frame 2 and make sure that your content also exists on frame 2 so that we can guarantee it's there when we try and tween it. So I'm just going to cross my fingers and hope that works, but I just need to add a stop. So we don't want this animation to keep playing. I'm going to stop the animation at the top of my code. I'm going to publish it again and hope it works. So let's give that a try. Something happened. Where have they all gone? That's not quite right, but it's doing something. Let's have a quick read. Frame number in Easel.js starts at 0 instead of 1. Yeah, so it's not liking something. I'm just going to try and simplify the tween a bit. I'll get rid of the alpha. And publish it. Flick back and refresh. They're all going off screen, so there's obviously something wrong. Timeline from, I've never had that, that's never happened, so it's almost like the relative bit's not working and they're actually going to minus 50 instead of 50 away from where they were, which is interesting. So let's maybe get rid of the y and let's have alpha from 0. So I'm not actually going to move anything. Refresh that. It's almost like my stop command isn't working. Funky. Oh, it's probably this dot stop. Would it be? If it's something that simple, that might be annoying. Let's publish that again. Give it a go. So let's refresh. Of course it was. Get in the habit of throwing this in front of everything. Even in ActionScript, it's not going to break it, so might as well chuck it in. Let's flick back and put the y bits back in. So y from relative minus 50 and the alpha from 0. Publish that, refresh the page, and we're sorted. The white lines you're seeing are where shapes just about overlap. So really I could do with scaling up or moving some of my shapes so they definitely overlap instead of having a chance of a gap. It's a bit like a 3D issue. If you try and align 3D objects perfectly, sometimes you see that tear between them. I'm not really bothered, but in your final version you might want to tweak it a bit. So for example, this block would need to be a little bit wider. And then we wouldn't see that in the finished thing. But yeah, something for you to play around with. The next step in this one is that I want to make it a bit more, I flick back to the Flash one, I want to make it a bit more future-proof for when my objects become a bit more complicated. So I'll give you an example of that. If I select this right-hand tower and I convert that to a new object. So if I convert that to a symbol, let's call it tower1 and press OK, and then I run the code again. Notice what happens to that rightmost tower. All comes in one go. So what we need to do is check every object as we bring it in to see if that object itself has any children. And we want to apply a tween to those, which gets a bit involved because if those children have children, and they might have children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and you've got your Auntie Ethel in there somewhere, we need to account for all of that. So we're going to flick back to the ActionScript 3 and we're going to make a recursive function. A recursive function is one that uses itself. Just grab a drink. So yeah, we're going to evolve this slightly. And I'm going to make a function, let's call it animate content. So the function is going to be called animate content. It is going to contain this for loop, so let's keep that for now. And then in the brackets, we want to kick it off with a display object container. So a type of object that can have children in Flash is called a display object container. So I'm going to put DOC for display object container. And I'm going to type it, so colon display object container, let's just find that. Hit enter. Flash will import it, you don't need that. So I'm going to get rid. Close the bracket, start the function, and then the function is going to close at the bottom of this for loop. So I'm just going to indent that slightly. But we're not quite finished there. So that's going to go through all the objects currently on screen, which we don't want. We want it to go through all the objects in our display object container. So instead of numChildren, we're going to have doc.numChildren. And instead of getChildAt, we're going to have doc.getChildAt. We could neaten this up a little bit by saving this particular object, because we are going to use it a couple of times. So if it gets a bit messy, in fact, we'll just do it now, we'll future-proof it. So I'm going to clip that bit from there. I'm going to make up a name, let's call it child. And above that, we're going to define what the child is. So I'm going to make a variable called child, and this is just going to be a standard display object. We don't need that import. So anything that can be displayed is a display object. They all inherit from there at some point. And it's just going to be a paste job of what we just clipped out. So our child variable is going to be the current thing we're looking at, and then we can use the name child instead of having to type that all the time. And that should work fairly similar. If we use that function now, if I flick down to line 12 and put animate content to make use of this function, and then I want everything to animate in, so I'm going to use this. This is referring to the timeline, so I want to animate all the content on the timeline and just test that to make sure it's working. It is, which is good, but we've still got the issue because we've not made the function call itself again yet. So when we hit this last object, or when we hit any object for that matter, that is itself a display object container, we want to call this function on that object. And we're going to do that down here. So I'm going to have an if. After the tween for the parent object, we're going to check to see if it's got any children that also need tweening in. There's no point doing this before you've tweened the parent, because if the parent's invisible, the children will be. So we've got to make sure that the parent is tweened in first, which it is there on line 8, and then line 9 we're going to ask if child is, so if the child itself is a display object container, then we want to do some stuff. So we're going to have curly brackets, and in here we just want to call the function again. So we want to animate content, and then in here we want to animate the content of the child, but we need to tell Flash to treat the child as a display object container instead of just a display object. So we're going to cast it there. Treat the child as a display object container. And that should, hopefully, get to the end and animate that last object in its entirety. There we go. So that is now future-proofed, where if you came along and you wanted to make the scene much more advanced, let's really quickly just, I'm going to delete them. And I'm going to use one of these blocks as the floor. So I'm going to have a floor at the bottom. And then I'm going to copy everything. I'm going to make a new layer that I put underneath the original. So this is, because this is behind it, all of the objects that we place on this layer are going to be earlier in the display list, so they're going to animate in first. So ultimately our content is going to animate in from back to front, which is quite good. Just so I can position it, I'm going to quickly hide that first one. Paste it in. Let's move it up a little bit, maybe scale it down a touch, and let's mirror it. Just put it. I'm going to put it over here a little bit, and then I'm going to move the other castle so that we can see more of this one in the background. So it's higher up, it's smaller, and I'm actually going to tint it all. So I'm going to select all of that, go to the properties, and this is what we can't do in HTML5, unfortunately, or not well at least. I'm going to put a colour effect, tint, and let's just, purple will do, purple's fine. Let's bring that front layer back and just reposition it all so we can actually see the background past it. Not so much, but oh well, you get the idea. Give that a try. And because the code works back to front, that new layer, because it's underneath, comes in first. I really should have sped it up. In comes the floor, and we start our front layer. So that's pretty much it in terms of what we saw at the start with my original scene. That's basically everything. It's just a case of constructing your scene. So as a quick breakdown of this one, I had my basic objects. What have we got there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 objects build that whole scene. I've put a bit of a glow on there, which HTML5 doesn't like too much. And then over the top, I've got a few bits. So I've got a vignette, which is just a radial gradient, quite a subtle one. I've got the tint at the top. If we just hide this mask and unlock it, the tint layer is just a big rectangle that's actually solid white. I've put an orange tint on it, and I've set the blending to multiply. So everything underneath it is having its colour value multiplied orange, or reduced until it's a bit orange. And that all builds up to give you what we saw at the start. So it starts purple, and ultimately that big tint at the end kicks in, multiplies everything underneath. Ta-da! Notice it reverses, I haven't covered that yet. that is something worth doing. You can ask your timeline, your Greensock timeline, to do something at the end. So really quickly in the code, I'm going to speed it up a bit. I don't want them to take this long, so I'm going to drop that to 0.2 and offset them by 0.1. And when we make the timeline light, we can actually give it an object. So we can do a curly bracket in here and we can give it a bunch of information. The one I'm going to use at the moment is onComplete. So when it's finished, when the timeline is done playing, we can do something. We can just make up a function name here. So onComplete, colon, and let's call it rev. So I'm going to reverse. Let's call it rewind, so it's a bit more intuitive. So rewind, and I just need to make that function now. So underneath it, really quickly, we put function, rewind, and the function body is just going to be timeline.reverse. Give that a try. It should be faster, and when it's all in, it should automatically reverse itself. Yeah. And off it goes. If you wanted that then to bounce back, you could have another property in here which is on reverse complete, and you would make another function to play it again. So this would be timeline.play in your new function. This all gets a bit trickier in the HTML5 one, so I'm going to focus on that now. Yeah, let's close this code up. I'm going to copy all the content, so I'm going to copy these two layers. Let's copy the layers instead. No, just copy the frames. Flick to my HTML5 version. Let's delete this layer just because. Just click the bin. Forgetting how to Flash. Do you even Flash? And let's paste those frames. Make sure that they last long enough, so that second layer isn't long enough. And HTML5 is going to kick up a bit of a fuss about that tint, I think. If I just straight publish that, give it a go, you're going to get a warning. Color effects are published as field, blah, 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 blah. Have a read of it. Basically, it means it doesn't handle it very well. It's doing okay so far. I think the problem will be that last one, yeah. So you see at the end, the left side of the purple tower didn't. It's basically a bitmap. So when we come to do the recursive part, I'm fairly sure that won't count as lots of individual bits. I might be making that up. I might be talking absolute nonsense, but it's saying filters are expensive. Oh, sorry, caching as a bitmap is automatically enabled when a filter is applied. Okay, so if it's turning our tint into a filter and filters are cached as bitmaps, then potentially that entire object is one picture instead of the constituent parts. So let's worry about it later. Let's get to the code, flick back to our JavaScript version. And we're going to follow a similar process, but without any of the typing and stuff. You're still going to type on your keyboard, but we're not going to type any of the information. So function animate content, and instead of, we don't tell it it's going to be a display object container. We just need to use a name. So we're not going to tell it what it is, but we do need to name it. Similar process here where we just indent the for loop. This .getNumChildren now becomes .getNumChildren. Timeline from becomes, right, this is where we made the child, isn't it? So let's do that again. Instead of this .getChild, let's put child, and above it we're going to make a variable called child, and it's going to be doc.getChild. So far so good. And then underneath it, this is slightly different to the way ActionScript is implemented. We can't use the is keyword the same way we did in ActionScript. So instead, we're going to put if child instance of, and then we want create JS CJS dot container. I'm hoping that's right. Basically, we're asking if the current child is a create.js container. So if it's possible that this object could contain other objects, we want to animate the content of that object. So let's throw a child in there. And then we need to actually use this function, don't we? So let's animate content for this. So to animate the content of everything again. Now I'm worried I've not used the word this enough times. So I'm thinking maybe that should be this child, but let's give it a go. And refresh that. Oh. Now I'm not going to be worried if the purple tower doesn't work perfectly. I'm going to assume it's because of that filter. Yeah, so that tower bit there came in as one object when really it should be lots, but it's because the filter's cached it as a bit up. The real kicker is going to be the end of this tower. So if this one comes in properly, which it has, success! We have success there. That's pretty much all the code I want to go through. Feel free to flesh your scenes out a little bit more. You can actually make a video of this, so just to highlight it in the Flash one, I've flipped back to my Flash version. In fact, I'll show you my haunted one because it's a bit nicer. All I did to make the video was first get an indication of how long the animation is by going to my code, and at the very end of everything, so after I've animated it, I did a trace, so trace, and then in brackets I did timeline.duration. And just ran the code so we can see when it runs that my animation is about 9¼ seconds. So then when I go File, Export, Export Video, I can choose a suitable place, which I already have. I've actually put my time in as well, which is based on this number anyway, so I just added a few seconds so we can appreciate the end of it. I think that will actually kick into the reverse time, but not to worry. I don't want to ignore the stage colour. I don't want to convert it in Adobe Media Encoder right now, but if I hit export, give it a sec, and flick to my folder, I've now got this coded haunted scene movie, which might need to convert when it first opens, but that's not a big issue. Give it a second. And there we go. So we've got what is potentially HD video. This one isn't. It's sort of half 1080p. But it runs in real time. Even if your code was really laggy, it would actually sort of restrict itself so that the video was real time. There you go. I think I'm going to leave it at that, but hopefully you learned something. Don't want to save that. Thank you. If that was worthwhile, I might come back to being a YouTuber.